And good morning. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020. This is my backup channel for McDuff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA, a channel which has been terminated by the gods at YouTube who do not believe in free speech. So we are here on the backup channel to continue the message as long as we can, and if they strike this channel, we will create another one because we do believe in free speech. So I'm glad you're here on this very, very busy morning. I would expect most people would be looking at the news, looking to see what's going on with the election. Hello, Norman. Hello, Corky. And hello, everyone else, as you're joining here. We have 10, and audience is growing. So just to say hello for a little while and to say once again what a privilege it is to have you guys with me, because I'm telling my dad's story and then I get things back that are just amazing gifts, such as Doug Valentine's ability to identify my dad in one of his books. George Webb's amazing effort to write a book about my dad while he's fighting this crazy deep state election at the same time. And I think that tells you that it's all tied together pretty tightly, as that's my theme at McDuff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. Is the theme is that my dad was the guy that they feared the most. And my dad was maybe the last or one of the last real military guys in the Pentagon. I mean, you had most of them, and certainly by now, they've all become CIA people. And there's a big difference between a CIA attitude and a military attitude. And I think that's what brought my dad down, because they could not handle his honesty. They couldn't handle his necessity of dealing with reality, and they kept on pushing their crazy agenda of what I've termed my show today to be called pacification instead of peace. Yeah, so let's get started. Corky, you remind me our sense of abundance. Yeah, it's all a matter of um, sharing. It's all a matter of, do we acknowledge each other's humanity and care for the sick? You know, give shelter to the homeless. Do we offer a glass of water to a traveler? What do we do about fellow humans that are suffering? And there's only two answers. You either run to them with help or you run away from them with fear. So no, there's no scarcity. There's just an unwillingness to share. You know, I'm building a list of all the fallacies behind the deep state mentality. The first one is, of course, racism. I mean, they are the most blatant and obvious racists. They created the whole idea of black racism, and then they end up blaming it on poor white people because they can, because they control the media, because they are the hidden hand. You've seen all those pictures of the generals and Napoleon and all with their hand inside of their breast tunic. And what are they saying? They're saying, "Hey, we're part of the hidden hand, man. We're insiders. We know the codes." Yeah, yeah, they were standing next to President Lincoln back then too. They're not new. The guys with the hands in the shirts. No, I mean I've shown you many times on the show how it's mathematically clear that everybody on the planet could fit within the state of Alaska and have a 2,400-foot home, you know, without being crowded. And the idea of us being overcrowded with people is ridiculous. Plus, what happened to our dream? You know, our dream that we're going to go to the moon. You know, well, they can put a lot of people on the moon once we conquer it, right? What about Mars? Why aren't we thinking, you know, why are we worried about overpopulation when we're expanding our reach into the solar system? Doesn't make any sense. And yet, I was listening to Aldous Huxley earlier today, one of his interview with Mike Wallace, which is quite eye-opening. You know, and he's very obviously British, you know. And oh, he has the most gorgeous musical voice. He goes, well, we start thinking. All right, I won't do that. Don't do that, John. Be nice. Aldous Huxley is not a man to mock, and I shouldn't have done that because he carries a tremendous amount of weight. But his two big things are the same damn two big things that you get from a Bertrand Russell or a Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. or all of the Manhattan Project knuckleheads. And that is the fear of overpopulation. That's his number one thing that he says. That's the first big issue that we're facing that's going to lead us into 1984, into the totalitarian nightmare with the government having its boot on everyone's neck. He says we're headed there. But one of the reasons he gives is overpopulation. And that, of course, is Rockefeller propaganda. Because we're not overpopulated. We're simply too concentrated into cities, into small places so that they can control the resources of the planet and force us to buy from them. I like that, ECAT. Yeah, let's put the Predator class on Mars and, you know, maybe set up a nice margarita bar for them there so they can sip and enjoy each other's brilliant company. Well, we are expanding our reach here on McDuff Channel by trying to put together a 3-part series on what I call the basis, the almost the Bible of my revision of history in accordance with McDuff's life. So this is my book, kind of unfolding as you hear it, as I write it, and the anchor of this book is Fletcher Prouty's The Secret Team. All right. Well, the first of our 3-part series focused on the focal system, the focal point system, invented by Allen Dulles, implemented in the Air Force by Fletcher Prouty, at the orders of his superior, the Chief of Staff, General Thomas D. White. And what Prouty put together was a network of hidden CIA agents in all of the important parts of the Air Force. And he called these his Tab 6. So wherever part of the Air Force something needed to come from, Allen Dulles wouldn't have to go to the head of that department and say, hey, I need this, and go fill out the forms and, you know, go through the bureaucracy. No, he would have a focal point. So suppose that he needed some particular missiles. Well, Fletcher Prouty would have set up a focal point officer in the division of the Air Force, and I don't know what it is, but the whatever part it is that distributes the missiles to the various units. And then there would be a conversation, such as we heard on the second part of our series, where the guy from Textron comes in and says, I'm looking to see if helicopters are going to be needed in the next few years, because I'm thinking about investing in a Bell helicopter. And, well, the guy that sells the missiles is now going to get involved, right? And you're going to see that the military-industrial complex is Fletcher Prouty's Tab 6 in the Air Force. Now, put a Fletcher Prouty in the Army, and one in the Navy, and one in the Marines, and one in the Coast Guard, and one in the FBI, and one in the State Department, and one in the Customs Service, and one in the IRS, and you can see that anything Alan Dulles wants is at his beck and call through this system set up called the focal point system. Pardon me. Now, why did Alan Dulles, the director of CIA, do this? This brings me back to the book itself. And I'm going to start at a part that I've read before, in the ones that YouTube decided I didn't get to publish because they hate free speech. And it's page 167 at the bottom, and I'm going to start reading. In addition to its independence, the intelligence community does not have its own pecking order. Much has been written about the behind-the-scenes friction and massive power struggle between the CIA and the DIA. The director of the DIA sits on the board with the rest of the community under the chairmanship of the DCI. That's Dulles, the director of Central Intelligence. But this does not in any manner mean that he works for and is subservient to the DCI or to any part of the CIA. The DCI serves at the direction of the National Security Council and the President. And the director of the DIA is responsible to the Secretary of Defense, who is by law one of the members of the National Security Council, and in that capacity is also one of the DCI's bosses. Well, try to draw that on an org chart, and you see what they've done is they've made it impossible to trace the chain of command. There's no chain of command in the intelligence agencies. And these people are insinuated into the military agencies, which depend upon a chain of command. A military with no chain of command is no military. It's a bunch of gangs. It's all so obvious. So what they've done is they've created a Gordian knot of displaced responsibilities sorted out in such ways that you can't tell who's giving orders to who. As recently as September 1971, during a meeting with a prominent and important member of the House of Representatives, I was asked, and this is Fletcher Prouty writing in 72, what is the chain of command to the director of the DIA? From this man, who serves as chairman of a key unit of Congress, this was no artless or idle question. And other than citing the obvious that the director of the DIA serves the Secretary of Defense, there is no other way to answer that question. If anyone would try to find a niche for that director under a hierarchy headed by the DCI, he would be wasting his time. We find then, nearly 25 years after the creation of the CIA, that it has remained as the coordinator of information and little more, as long as we are talking about intelligence as an advisory and staff function. When we come into the field of clandestine operations and the inner and more secret pecking order of the secret team, we find a truly different situation. This is as Allen Dulles planned it. His biggest cover story of all was the fact that he served as the DCI and that his most able agents were not in the field waging an active campaign against the enemies of the United States, but were serving inside the government of the United States and inside of many greatly influential non-government areas to create a secret team that dominated the entire operational activity of the United States government in peacetime. And that, my friend, is why this book is subtitled The CIA and Its Allies in Control of the United States and the World. The use of the word peacetime in this context is fraught with danger and does not mean what might be expected. There are those who say that we have been at war since 1945 in a great worldwide Cold War struggle against communism and other enemies of this nation. But that is not the way the term peacetime is used in the secret team's clandestine activity dictionary. The rules of war are traditional and are quite clear and uncontroversial. When the nation goes to war legally by act of Congress and in accordance with these rules, there can be no question about the pecking order and who is in charge of things. The president is the commander-in-chief, and everyone else from the president on down to the private is in the uniformed services, and the industrial and the civilian defense workers has his neat role and position in the chain of command, as the emergency law may prescribe. But when this nation is not at war, there are no such rules. In accordance with custom, international law, and social tradition, when a country is not at war, it is at peace. I pause to emphasize peace. When we are not at war, we are at peace. Well, we haven't declared war, but we're not at peace. So there you go. War is peace. Peace is war. In the Cold War era that has persisted since World War II, there is a feeling that we are engaged in a life-and-death struggle with world communism that verges on real war. At least this is the doctrine of those activists who make a career of promoting anti-communism. Before World War II, there was a wave of anti-communism, but it was more an expression of choice between the fascism of Italy, Germany, and Japan, or the communism of Russia. It was fanned to a strong flame during the Spanish Civil War, when the loyalists were for the most part on the side of communism, and the rebels were the supporters of General Franco's version of one-man rule. Since World War II, communism has been a term that is often applied to almost anything, anyone, and any nation which, in the eyes of the zealous pro-American, is opposed to his views of what is American. Inside the secret team, this kind of thinking has created the phrase, quote, peacetime operations. which has its own meaning. A peacetime operation is almost always what anyone else would call a peacetime military operation, or, since this is an obvious anachronism, a clandestine operation. By using this special term, peacetime operation, the special team keeps the command and direction of such operations from the military, where it would be if it were a real and not a covert operation, and keeps it from the State Department by putting it in the classification of a military activity, even though calling an operation in peacetime a military operation does not make sense. All of this explanation may sound to the uninitiated like a lot of muddy logic, but in spite of the difficulty that exists in trying to explain how the secret team rationalizes itself, this narrative would be less than honest and less than complete if an effort was not made to delineate the unusual and very contrived paths of reasoning that have been built up through the years. So we have Alan Dulles, who has built up a network called focal points in the U.S. government, and thereby has his ability to pull strings whenever he needs them. Now, the next part pardon me a second. The next part picks up where we left off on part 2 of our little series. Following the policy of the National Security Act of 1947 and such other directives as NSCID 5412/2, it recognized that there might be requirements for clandestine activity from time to time. Then it went further than those earlier directives and became much more explicit. It said that any small and truly covert operation may be assigned to the CIA, and that any which were larger would be the subject of special study and planning, and then, quote, may be assigned to the military. That part of the military which would be sufficient only to carry out that one operation on a one-time basis. It directed that large covert operations would not be assigned to the CIA. This attempt at clarification provided the opportunity for the CIA and its fellow travelers with a chance to blow up the balloon. They counterattacked with a long and drawn-out argument about what was a small operation and what was a large one. Then they proceeded to argue about what happens if the agency goes into some country and then it expands. At what point will the CIA operation be transitioned from the CIA to the military, solely on the basis of size? The CIA argued that if it remained covert, regardless of size, no such transition should take place. The whole point of the CIA argument was to invalidate the president's controlling mechanisms, which depended on a scale of size. So, Fletcher Prouty has explained to us in his book that the CIA does, under these regulations, the NSC regulations, have the authority to do covert operations, but only under the direction of the National Security Council. What the CIA is doing is constantly undermining the chain of command from the National Security Council to the Director of Central Intelligence, so that it's all so opaque and obscure that the actual NSC doesn't really know what Alan Dulles and his CIA are actually doing. So he has basically created a separate entity outside the chain of command, outside the separation of powers, outside checks and balances, and basically a force that can stealthily pull levers within the U.S. military and government to achieve what it wants to achieve. Where does he get his direction from? Well, he's a lawyer. He does what his clients tell him. Wall Street. On when to transition the concept will be noted that even 10 years later, after the escalation of military manpower had reached the staggering figure of 550,000 men, to say nothing of gross amounts of civilian manpower, the central leadership was never transitioned to the military, as President Kennedy's NSAM 57 had ordered. If anyone wanted an example of how far the secret team can turn things around, this is one of the best. In June 1961, the president stated only one thing categorically. By 1962, the Army's spokesman, actually a CIA special teams, secret team spokesman, had totally turned this around in his counterinsurgency doctrine and definition. Then, after President Kennedy died, the secret team retained control of most of the Vietnam War from its earliest birth pangs to the peak of escalation. Even to this day, the combat phase of the Vietnamese War, which is called, quote, pacification, unquote, and which in fiscal year 1972 cost more than $1 billion, is totally under the direction and control of the CIA. The key to all this, the matter that made it so easy for the secret team to wrest control of this major peacetime covert operation, even from the hands of the President and Commander-in-Chief, lay in the words of the Army General quoted above, quote, "The Joint Chiefs of Staff have recently established within the Joint Staff a special staff section dealing exclusively with the problem of counterinsurgency." Okay, you know what that is, right? This was a carefully designed move, and it emerged from a formative series of events. Almost from the time of the creation of the CIA, the Secretary of Defense had maintained on his immediate staff an assistant to the Secretary for Special Operations. Among other things, this man was charged with the responsibility for liaison with the CIA, NSA, State, and the White House. His area of interest was almost totally within the field of clandestine operations, although he was interested in routine intelligence matters and other related functions. For the 5 or 6 years prior to the Kennedy inauguration, this office was filled by an extremely able and wise figure, a retired 4-star Marine General, Graves B. Erskine. He had served in that capacity longer than any man had ever served in the office of Secretary of Defense at such a level. His tenure had covered service under Wilson McElroy Gates and, for a brief period, Robert McNamara. As he was utilized by the secretaries prior to McNamara, he kept a close eye on all CIA operational activity that involved the military in any way. And whenever, in his judgment, things were going too far, he would inform the secretary, and in most instances, the CIA would be asked to drop its request for military support, which generally was tantamount to halting the project. Erskine's role was one of considerable quiet power, yet he used it sparingly. Then, shortly after, U.S. Air Force Colonel Edward G. Lansdale came back from Saigon, where he had been working for the CIA ever since the establishment of the GEM regime, and immediately before that had been in Manila. During the selection and establishment of the Magsaysay regime, he was assigned to General Erskine's office at the specific request of Allen Dulles. See what's going on here? Dulles is putting his man in there, which Lansdale is in Dulles' hip pocket since World War II. He's putting him in there to stop the military from saying no. Along with a number of other CIA agents cover plants in the Office of Secretary of Defense, Lansdale provided a strong counterfoil to his boss, General Erskine, within the military departments where he was known, except to a few only, as an Air Force officer on the Secretary of Defense staff. You see the deception? The deception of our military officers is completely unacceptable. We depend on our military officers to keep us safe, to keep ready to fight for our freedoms. And you're putting these CIA plants in there, undercover, working against the chain of command of the military. This is the cancer. These are the sinews of the deep state. This is why the secret team is the anchor of my research. When McNamara became secretary, he was advised that he really would not need an assistant for special operations. He abolished that office. Then many of the old office staff were dispersed, especially in one sudden move the day after the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation. Those who were left were moved to a new office, which was then headed by General Lansdale, recently promoted. Shortly after the new Lansdale office had been established, I was asked by General Earl Wheeler, then the director of the Joint Staff, if that function would not be better applied if it were moved from the Office of Secretary of Defense to the Joint Staff, so that it might be applied uniformly for all the services and for the many major military commands overseas. He discussed this further with McNamara. In a most unusual administrative maneuver required because of the stringent limitations of the size of the Joint Staff, my office was transferred from OSD to the Joint Staff, along with the necessary manpower spaces and authorization to staff the office. This small staff was joined later by another highly classified group, which performed a somewhat related function. Then, as a progression of the first move, the Joint Staff created an office called the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, SACSA. This new office was much larger than the original office that had moved down from OSD, and it brought with it a large staff of CIA-oriented personnel from all services. It had several temporary special assistants, among them General Hemkes and General Craig, before it acquired its greatest and most dynamic driving force, U.S. Marine General Victor H. Krulak. The important thing to understand is that the much heralded office of SACSA had very few military responsibilities. It was almost entirely CIA-oriented. Most of its dealings with the services were in areas in which the CIA was most active. For example, the great proportion of its dealing with the Army was strictly limited to Special Forces activity. With the Air Force, it was for most part limited to special air warfare activity. And with the Navy, it was active in the SEAL teams. There were other duties, of course, but most of them gave the office something it could say it was doing while it performed its primary task of supporting the CIA, the secret team, and of breathing life into the massive Frankenstein called counterinsurgency. SACSA played another very important role in the highest level policy discussions of this country. It has been said that Kennedy wanted to get out of Vietnam in 1963, but deferred it until after his re-election, as he told Senator Mike Mansfield, because such a move would stir up a Joe McCarthy wave of sentiment and would lose him support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Kennedy knew best was the voice of SACSA. The one officer he saw from the Joint Staff more than anyone during these crucial days was General Krulak. Technically, General Dean should have been the action man, but he was the operations director of the Joint Staff. But General Dean was not the CIA's secret team man. This was because Allen Dulles and Maxwell Taylor, at that time the military advisor to the president, opened the door for Krulak, since Krulak's job was, quote, to support the CIA. General Krulak's closest advisors were such men as Bill Bundy, a long-time career CIA man on McNamara's staff at the time, General Lansdale, and other key CIA agents and high officials, whose names will be omitted because some of them are still active. Some of these highly placed officials were so deeply covered that it is possible that no one in OSD, including Krulak, knew that years ago they had been planted by the CIA. You see the hornet's nest that my dad walked into? These are secret team agents all around him, and he doesn't know it. Thus, when he worked frequently with a man in the Department of Research and Engineering from whom he had been told he could get some assistance, it's quite possible he never knew the man he saw was from Dulles's office. Later, when Maxwell Taylor had become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the only JCS John Kennedy knew was even more CIA biased, since Maxwell Taylor himself was by that time more oriented toward the secret team than the military, and Krulak was closer than ever to the president. Thus, it was not the real military that Kennedy would have offended if he had withdrawn from Vietnam in 1963. It was the chameleon secret team CIA military who made him think they would have objected. In this special sense, the creation of SACSA and the appointment of Maxwell Taylor as chairman of the Joint Chiefs were most influential events. It is no wonder secret team writers have made so much of the great importance to them and to the CIA of SACSA. A careful review of the Pentagon Papers will see how well documented all of this is, especially if he observes how many, quote, JCS papers were actually not bona fide JCS papers, were in reality SACSA Special Team CIA papers, attributed only to the JCS, the Joint Chiefs, that is. As important to the secret team as SACSA was, of equal importance was the return to the government and especially to the Pentagon of Maxwell Taylor. After the Bay of Pigs, it was inevitable that Allen Dulles would leave the CIA. His chief lieutenant, Dick Bissell of U-2 fame and of Laos and Bay of Pigs infamy, left the agency to become the head of the Institute of Defense Analysis, an organization with many interesting functions. among them acting as conduit for CIA activities. Dulles again showed that uncanny ability of his and the agency's to rise above each fiasco on to new heights. During the Bay of Pigs inquiry, he ingratiated Maxwell Taylor to the Kennedys so firmly that Jack Kennedy assigned General Taylor to the position of military advisor to the president. This was a good cover assignment for General Taylor. For those who thought he might be interfering with the duties and prerogatives of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, this assignment caused a few raised eyebrows. Dulles and Maxwell Taylor were content to let those rumors and fantasies spread because they did much to help transfer some of the blame for the Bay of Pigs from the CIA to the military. However, everyone else in the need-to-know clan knew that Maxwell Taylor was in the White House to be the president's liaison man with the CIA. The president may not have known how closely Maxwell Taylor's aspirations and those of Allen Dulles matched each other. During the last days of the Dulles era, Maxwell Taylor served as the focal point man between Dulles and his agency and the White House. This was a perfect role for Maxwell Taylor. He had quit the Army to encourage, with all support and haste, the urgent development of the new flexible response Army, attuned to the needs of the CIA. Thus, all of the pressures and behind-the-scenes efforts piled up before Vietnam and came to a head in Vietnam. As we have said before, the logistics equipment in huge amounts from Indonesia, Tibet, Laos, and the Bay of Pigs, and many other operations, all began to accumulate in Vietnam, along with the secret team personnel, who saw an opportunity to accomplish, almost with abandon, all the things they had failed to do or had been unable to do before. While this was going on, quietly and quite subtly before his eyes, President Kennedy did a lot of talking with many old hands about, quote, what has gone wrong with the Bay of Pigs, and what is the meaning of Vietnam. As has been ably reported by many good writers, President Kennedy was forming his own opinion of what was going on, and the evidence is that he was quite close to the facts and to a real evaluation of what was happening. One of Kennedy's closest friends, Kenny O'Donnell, reports that General MacArthur had stunned the president in 1961 after the Bay of Pigs with his warnings about the folly of trying to match Asian manpower and how the absurdity of the domino theory in a nuclear age, and about the absurdity of the domino theory in a nuclear age. Something to think about. The domino theory. If you don't stop them here, they'll knock down the next country and the next one and the next one. Well, that's absurd in the nuclear age, I guess. That's what MacArthur said. And, we know that MacArthur knew my dad. And my dad ended up in Saxa. I suspect MacArthur had something to do with that. This was a perfect role of Maxwell Taylor. He had quit the Army. Oh, I read that already. Sorry. Attuned to the trumpet of Taylor's own choosing, counterinsurgency. Of course, Fletcher Prouty's reference to the trumpet of his own choosing is a reference to Taylor's book, Uncertain Trumpet. All the pieces were coming together, and during this formative period a new special group was formed. This was the special group of the NSC counterinsurgency, or the Special Group CI. This group presided over the CIA, State and Defense Departments. O'Donnell further reports the general employed the president to avoid a U.S. military buildup in Vietnam or any other part of the Asian mainland. And Mary McGrory, a reporter, has said, in words more truthful and important than she knew, quote, President Kennedy, who at the time was caught up in the counterinsurgency mania which had swept the new frontier, was subsequently startled by the passionate objections of Senator Mansfield. But he told Mansfield privately after a White House leadership meeting that he agreed with him on a need for a complete withdrawal from Vietnam. Quote, but I can't do it until 1965 after I get reelected, unquote. Kennedy had the misfortune, which he was overcoming rapidly, of being young and inexperienced in the inner ways of government, such as those employed by the secret team. He could not have realized that Maxwell Taylor, for example, by the time he had returned to the Pentagon as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was actually more of a Judas goat, as far as the military was concerned, than the leader of the herd, as he had been when he left 3 years before. Few great armies have been so vastly demoralized and stricken by an integral campaign as has the U.S. Army since those dark days of 1964 and 65, when Maxwell Taylor and his secret team counterparts led them into Vietnam under the banner of counterinsurgency. Fletcher Prouty is a man whose name will go down in history. So says Oliver Stone, who thought enough about him to do a movie based upon Fletcher Prouty's work. JFK, the assassination of JFK, the CIA, and Vietnam, his second book, which we read almost in its entirety on McDuff Channel before, of course, the YouTube purge of 2020, the Great Purge. All right, well, we will see if free speech does return to YouTube. I'd be surprised, but I would encourage them to terminate my channel at the earliest possible date to avoid the necessity of needless controversy. Well, there you go, guys. That's my 3-part series on the secret team. The book, the concept, the danger, the cancer, the insinuation of CIA agents into our government on behalf of the elites, the banks of Wall Street, the banks of the City of London, and the owners of so much of our corporate world. It doesn't need to be this way. We don't need this CIA. Break it up, splinter it, cast it to the winds. Thanks for being with me. Have a great day.